Welcome to Point Blank. I'm Yvonne.
And I'm Christina.
Well, the US presidential race is heating up, and as the world turns its attention to who might become the next US president, we all can't help but wonder, right?
Yes.
What kind of shoes will he have to fill?
Well, it's heave and ho for the polls in the race to the White House. Now, with the almost daily numbers scuttling along, however, some things don't change much, especially not President George W. Bush's numbers.
Yep, not his numbers. Well, Bush now enters his 23rd consecutive month with an approval rating under 40%. Currently, it stands at 32%. Well, pretty unpopular pair of shoes to fill for the next US president, if you ask me.
Inevitably. Now, the only way to go seems to be to sing a different tune from Bush, and you will be all right. Now, so both candidates, Barack Obama and John McCain, are promising change from the Bush presidency. But is that the best way for America and the world?
Well, we wonder. So in our living room tonight, we have a most esteemed guest since the president has had this perpetual publicity cloud over him. We have Dr. Tan See Sing, an expert on regional and security issues in East and Southeast Asia. He also heads the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies research program on multilateralism and regionalism. So we can see this is right up your alley, Dr. Tan.
I certainly hope so. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, just to kick off, what's your stand on Bush? Do you like him? Do you think that he deserves what he's getting in terms of publicity flack?
Well, certainly I think Bush, for one person, has received a lot of very negative feedback, very negative reactions. But having said that, I think we may give him short shrift, I think, too often. So despite all the negative attention, and he has done a lot of things that rightly so deserve criticism. But having said that, I think as far as Bush's policy in Asia were concerned, I think one could probably point to a couple of so-called good things that he has done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll look at those good things in a while. For now, we will look at something a bit more lighthearted. You know that the US is quite open about digging fun at their presidents.
Yeah, they have actually developed quite a hobby for slamming them. Now, but for President Bush, he seems to top them all, doesn't he?
Yeah, his demeanor, his antics and speech for power, well, they attract all the wrong sort of attention.
Yeah, he's a constant butt of jokes on many US talk shows, and with segments like Top 10 Favorite Bush Moments. So we've seen that.
Yeah, no, not really, but I suppose we'll see it really soon because, the political satire sites just love him. They use him as the subject of spoofs and political humor. Well, let's take a look at some of the more memorable Bush blunders.
The category tonight are top 10 favorite George W. Bush moments. Top 10 favorite. This is an accumulation. Top 10 favorite George W. Bush moments.
During these last few months, I've been trained by Al-Qaeda.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Eventually, we're going to have to do something about that nuclear technology.
Come on, Bushy. You know it is just for peaceful purposes.
I'm just a little concerned about the levels of nuclear radiation.
But it isn't enough to harm anyone. My advisors, they can vouch for me on that one. You can put cheese in an aerosol can, but you can't figure out common sense. Good job, Bushy.
That's President Bush to you.
Is everything okay, sir?
Everything's fine, big time.
Not one doubt in my mind that we will fail. I didn't realize I had this left here. Tariffs and barriers everywhere are torn down. In order for us to get the framework, the groundwork to discuss a framework for peace, to lay the... All right.
I know that human being and fish can coexist peacefully. So, In my State of the Union, or my speech to the nation, whatever you want to call it, speech to the nation, fooled me once. Shame on you. You fool me, you can't get fooled again.
It's right. If you fool them once, you can't fool them again. What do you think of that? All these spoofs, rampant on the internet and on mass media, and how Bush is incompetent when it comes to speeches, even when he comes, or maybe incompetent as a president.
Yeah, even the way he pronounces his words is a little bit different from the rest of us over here.
Well, I think Americans have a lot of fun in spoofing their leaders and presidents, what have you, and that's all taken in I think in good fun, and that's not an issue. But I think despite the kinds of reactions that Bush seems to attract, he's a lightning rod for all this sort of negative attention and very critical attention. But having said that, I think there are a couple of things that we could probably point to with regards to his policy towards Asia that may not necessarily garner the kind of critical attention that he's been receiving worldwide, and sometimes deservedly so.
Mm-hmm. So with Bush, we know that he has made many mistakes, especially regarding the global war on terror, and he's even in his concentration on the global war on terror. Some of his critics say that he has neglected Asia, neglected China, neglected India, which are rising powers in the world. So what do you say to that?
Well, I wonder about those kinds of criticisms, because it seems to me if one were to look at Bush's record in Asia with a fine eye, I think one would see that perhaps for one singular reason, the war on terror, I think that more than anything else has provided Bush the perfect opportunity to redress some of the so-called earlier concerns that he may have had with regards to these nations in Asia, particularly China. Certainly, the war on terror has provided the perfect milieu, if you will, for cooperation amongst the United States and China and other Asian countries. And so I think in that sense, if only by default, unintentionally, if you will, Bush hasn't done so badly after all in Asia.
So what do you think of the merits to his policies then?
I think in particular, Bush, despite his proclivity, if you will, for unilateralism, we hear him being criticized time and again, and rightly so in many instances, for his penchant to behave in a very unilateral way without consulting others. Many of these accusations, of course, coming from the European Union and what have you. That all being said, I think Bush, in Asia in particular, has essentially stuck to the multilateral line. He has opted for multilateral cooperation, albeit in a very sort of a what the Americans call a la carte fashion, in a very utilitarian fashion. But all being said, I think we can at least note that he has indeed, I think, supported multilateral cooperation. He has taken the line that ASEAN deserves to take the lead in Asian security affairs and institutionalists of that nature. So I think we could point to some of these instances and say that Bush hasn't really been the sort of unilateralist that he seems to have at least performed and exercised in other parts of the world.
You reckon he's the U.S. president that has gotten the most flack, publicity-wise, more than any other U.S. president in history?
Well, I think well that I guess is arguable. I think maybe that might be a characteristic, a function of the fact that today we live in a technological age where reactions and responses are fast and furious and immediate. But having said that, I don't imagine that Mr. Bush, despite all the bad news that we have heard of him, is any different, if you will, from many other U.S. presidents. By very nature of the job, when you have the job is the most powerful man on earth, and all the policies and your actions basically have consequences, not just with regards to your own country, but also citizens of the world. I think that in and of itself attracts attention, it attracts reactions.
Exactly. We've seen just how he's been poked fun at, every single little, slip up he makes for good TV. But funny antics aside, this anti-Bush sentiment is definitely obvious in many places, with lots of negativity surrounding the current administration's foreign policies especially.
Yes, especially the Iraq War. Many have labelled it a mistake, and it's a constant reminder to the current presidency of its failure.
Yeah, that's true, but I think Newsweek's cover story over here, a rare piece on what Bush got right, seems to be singing a slightly different tune. While the editor of Newsweek International, Farid Zakaria, suggested in his story that simply reversing the current administration's policies is not the answer. Well, is there even a right answer for such complex issues? Well, our Razor TV team finds out.
Change is being seen as a panacea for US woes, with both presidential hopefuls Obama, Barack and John McCain promising a change from Bush. But at least one expert disagreed. In this week's Newsweek cover story, What Bush Got Right, author Farid Zakaria argued the change may not necessarily be good. He wrote that many of the hugely unpopular policies that provoked the greatest criticisms were mostly pursued in Bush's first term, but have now been modified, abandoned, and even reversed. For example, Iraq War, then invaded with too few troops, overwhelming use of military force, alienated the Iraqis. Now, new political military strategy, working with former insurgents to fight Al-Qaeda, reaching out to Iraq's neighbors. And in the areas of diplomacy, then reversal of efforts to negotiate with North Korea, declared by US as part of the axis of evil. Now, working out deal with Pyongyang, offering economic aid, taking North Korea off the terror countries list. With China and India, instead of a confrontational approach, US is adopting a strategic partnership stance.
So, would you agree with the Newsweek article then that says that the next president, whoever it may be, should not change for the sake of change?
Indeed. I mean, you look at the stakes in Iraq. I think even Obama, if he puts aside all this need to score points, will also agree. And I don't know what he interpreted of the situation on the ground, having consulted with the American commander there, that, he has to admit that some progress has been made. When Bush finally realized that, okay, you need to put in more troops, and not only put in more troops, make sure that troops support, the Iraqi government's priorities. There is progress on the ground in Iraq, and now people say, you should do the same to retrieve the situation in Afghanistan.
Are you saying that there's some merit in his policies, that he's not 100% wrong?
Yes, certainly. I would give him some credit because if you want to assess any American president's foreign policy on the basis of how it stabilizes world order and international relations, you have to, at least praise bits of their foreign policies where they open up channels of communication.
So what were the reasons for these modifications, even reversal of earlier foreign policies?
The Bush administration underwent the same learning curve as, the Clinton administration that he despised. You see? So by the time, the Bush administration entered the second term, I think due credit must be given to the fact that he and his team has learned from the first term's mistakes.
Whoever wins the presidency may have to take a closer look at the current policies, keeping in perspective the changes that has been made.
Well, Dr. Tan, it's interesting to see how Bush has changed his own tune ever since he started campaigning and tried to portray himself as everything Clinton was not, promising change from Clinton. And now his successors, Obama and McCain, are doing the exact same thing. And I remember a certain thing he said to Larry King on his show, that he said China is not a strategic partner like Clinton makes it out to be. In fact, he called China a competitor. So that bodes trouble for, Sino-US relations. So where does that put, the relations between US and China strained on the way for progress?
Well, your first point is very well taken. I think it is the nature of presidential elections where candidates will try to distinguish themselves from their predecessors, and sometimes in very vehement ways. And I think this is an unfortunate cyclical event that we see happening every 4 years or 8 years, depending on the terms of presidency. So in that regard, I think one cannot particularly fault George W. Bush for behaving that way. He's just doing what every other presidential candidate has done in the past. And so in that sense, I think, given the fact that here you have George W. Bush in the year 2000, I believe it was, running on a Republican slate against a reasonably popular Democrat president, Clinton, I mean. And so in that sense, I think the need to distinguish his policies from that of his predecessor clearly nudged him along the lines of proclaiming China as a strategic competitor. And we've seen, of course, some of the potential risks and perils of that sort of a policy line. But there you have, I guess, an attempt on his part to try to differentiate his policy stance vis-a-vis his predecessor.
Mm-hmm. We'll continue along that line, but for now we'll take a look at the comments that have already come in on the web. Already, Razorblade is saying, I think the world has been rather unfair to President Bush. Let's not forget that under his watch, he had to handle the worst and most horrendous event of the 21st century, which was 9/11. And he handled it pretty well. Would you say that any other American would have done better? And following on, he continues, Razorblade continues, let's not forget that many of President Bush's actions were the results of advice from the people around him. Yeah, his advisors, right? People chose and entrusted to give the best of advice. Well, he may not be the brightest of men for the role of commander-in-chief of the most powerful country in the world, but he is a decent and honest man.
Well, I am in agreement with the gentleman or lady who posted that comment. I think the world has given short shrift to George Bush, and I think in that sense, Fareed Zakaria and as well as Dr. Ellen Chong and his comments earlier on in the program are right to point out the fact that George Bush did do certain things right. Now, the question, of course, is whether he did these things intentionally, whether he had grand designs to nudge U.S. policy vis-a-vis Asia in a certain direction. That could be debated, of course.
Or whether he just fumbled along and, hey, I got the solution.
Well, in a manner of speaking, I mean, given the fact no one anticipated 9/11, right? No one anticipated that we will move very quickly from China being regarded as the world's most biggest security challenge to one that is focused and pivoting around the issue of terrorism. I think no one anticipated that, at least not in the global context and a level that took place in 9/11. So I think in that sense, Bush, as you rightly put it, fell into it. But I think, having said that, he's done pretty well. Of course, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask. Iraq, for example, some of the policies associated with that, the war on terror. But I think by and large, particularly where Asia is concerned, I think we could probably give him a pretty decent rating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's put our spotlight on Asia for now. So what does this mean? His modifications and alterations to his foreign policy. What does this mean for what does it mean for China, the entire of Asia, and a more macroscopic look at Southeast Asia and of course Singapore?
All right. Well, let's begin with the region-wide focus. I think it's fair to say after all that discourse about China being a strategic competitor, and I would imagine that of course that sort of a comment would be it would obviously provoke certain kinds of negative reactions. One wonders whether by calling China a strategic competitor, whether George Bush was intending that U.S. foreign policy is now going to take a very confrontational approach. I would surmise probably not. I suspect that Bush looked at China as essentially a geo-economic competitor. Everyone else did. for that matter, here in Asia as well. Japan did. And certainly, I think many countries in Southeast Asia were concerned that China would be a competitor for foreign investment and what have you. Some comments made about that great sucking sound to the north, which is China just sucking in all foreign investment. So I think a lot of countries and societies were concerned at the rise of China in various respects, of course. So in that sense, I think any negativity regarding George Bush's definition of China as a strategic competitor needs to take this into account. Having said that, I think because of the war on terror, clearly China moved very quickly from being a competitor to a very cooperative partner in the war on terror, at least a partner of the coalition. So in that sense, I think because of those changes, certainly China proved itself, if you will, to be not so much against an American-led order, if you will. One can't really say that China may have gratuitously accepted this, right? Maybe China tolerated the U.S. I don't know, maybe not. But I think certainly China, with its focus on economic development, clearly would support the liberal economic order, if you will, one that's very much driven by the United States.
Would you say Sino-U.S. ties are warming?
Well, I think they have been on an even keel by and large. Of course, when you have two great giants, two great elephants, if you will, you think back to that old proverb, when two elephants fight against one another, and what have you. Or for that matter, when these two giants come together, I think one cannot expect anything else but elements of cooperation as well as elements of competition and conflict, perhaps at certain times. But conflict is a fact of life, right? But the question is, how do we go about resolving conflict? And I think to that extent, one can say that China and the United States have done reasonably well.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going for a quick break soon, but stay tuned if you want to find out what Bush did right or wrong, and what it means to Southeast Asia, what it means to Singapore, and to Singaporeans like you and me. So stay tuned to Point Blank after the break.